Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
I want to conclude with the three questions I ask all of my guests, and I think there's no one I'd rather ask this about than you right now. And so we'll start with one that is we're getting awfully religious today, but I can't help it. It's something I think about all the time. Maybe just 1 second before I go there. I think one of the things I'm helping to do on the Into the Impossible podcast and with my own research is construct what Galileo's maybe it's his third or fourth book that people really know about, called The Assayer, Il Saggiatore. And it means the assayer, someone who tests something. Like if you want to see if this is gold, you don't need gold to test if it's gold. You take a piece of stone called a touchstone and you rub it on there and it makes a mark. The stone has no value, but it allows you to see the wealth of value that may be there or may be lying to you. So I've started kicking around this idea of a fellowship for all of those theorists across the quad from you that are and at the Institute for Advanced Study. And I've had all these people on. They're all friends of mine. Juan Maldacena, having Nima Akami Hamed on soon. I love these guys. John Preskill will be on next week. Your late friend Stephen Hawking's colleague Leonard Malone was on. But I always think about this question: why are there so many theories of everything? Why are there so few experiments of everything? And I said, well, there actually are a lot of experiments, but no one is looking at the data that already exists. So if you hadn't happened to look through the Pan-STARRS data, or if somebody hadn't thought to look through the data that when pulsars were discovered, in other words, data is abundant and cheap. It's like software, but how many? I know Facebook came out of Harvard, right? But very few cell phones have come out of Harvard. In other words, it's easier to produce software and theory, in my analogy, than hardware and testable assays. So I'm trying to cultivate this notion that people should look at data that already exists rather than coming up with a new theory of everything that has some beautiful properties of it.
I agree. I have an essay, Beware, that is titled "Beware of Theories of Everything" in Scientific American. I highly recommend.
Yeah, we're going to have a link to it in the notes.
And I advocate exactly your point.
Yeah. Okay. Final questions. These all relate some way to these theories of creativity and imagination, which nobody exemplifies better than you. So the first one has to do with what is known in Hebrew as a zava'ah, an ethical will. So Alfred Nobel, when he created the Nobel Prize, he said he had no kids, he had no wife, and he said, I want these to go to people who have caused the greatest benefit to humanity via their invention or discovery in physics, chemistry, etc. And of course, it dates back to the Bible, and Jacob blesses his sons, as they did in last week's Torah portion, for those that are playing along at home. But the notion and the book of Deuteronomy is basically Moses' last will and testament. And the question is for you: what would you put in your ideological will, in your ethical will, not your material will, but what would you put in your ethical will to benefit the millions of people that count you as not their biological father, Avi, in that sense, but their ideological inspiration?
Yeah, I was asked this question actually by the Harvard Gazette, the Pravda at Harvard University, and what is the one thing you would like to change about the world? And my answer was, I would like my colleagues to behave more like kids, to be driven by their curiosity, not to worry about making mistakes. We talked about all of these. And to be guided by what, nature educates us. And it's not about our egos. It's not about us getting honors, rewards, prizes, likes on Twitter. It's not about all of that. It's about figuring out how things work in the world. And by the way, I should say, sometimes religion is viewed as an antithesis to science, but it's not the case, because if you were to figure out how the world works, you can appreciate it more. It's just like looking at a watch and figuring out how it works. If you just look at the outside of a watch, it doesn't look as impressive. And so if you want to be at awe as to what reality is, the best way to do it is to pursue science, because that gives you the highest resolution image of the thing that you care about.
Right.
And so to me, science is really the way forward. That's the way to change our preconception. Unfortunately, what happens right now is because of some circumstances in the history of particle physics where the superconducting super collider project was canceled back in the 1980s. There was a long hiatus, a long period of time where theoretical physics did not receive new data, and that led a new culture in where data is not needed. You don't want you can work on things that are not falsifiable.
Right. It's a post-data environment, like deconstructivism, post-modern.
And it's even justified by philosophers, in some books that are written. And I find that dangerous to the spirit of modesty, of learning from the data what the world is, rather than believing, that we can come up. The only way we can come up with what reality is if we live in a simulation, as some people suggest. To me, it's like being on drugs. Let's put it this way. You can imagine that you have $1 billion, or that you have even $200 billion. You are wealthier than Elon Musk. Okay? You can imagine that. Fine. You can sit in your room and enjoy the idea. But if you go to the ATM machine and check your balance, that will give you a reality check and will educate you that you cannot have that dream and you cannot have that wonderful idea that is so appealing and that you can play with and have all kinds of ideas of what to do with the money and so, because there is a reality check. And that, to me, is an important lesson, because we can be bankrupt in terms of our ideas if we never test them against an ATM machine, which is experimental data.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. I always think about the meaning of the word science is knowledge, and the meaning of Torah or whatever is wisdom, as teacher, is something very different, and that wisdom requires humility, and knowledge doesn't. Right? You can have Wikipedia has a lot of knowledge. I'm working with some friends on a project I'm calling, Artificial Galileo or AI Galileo, about, basically taking all of his written words, and there's hundreds of thousands, if not a million words that he's written, putting it into, GPT-3 and churning out and see what you get. And maybe he can be a better teacher of, Galilean relativity than even Brian Keating. It's hard to believe. Okay. Next statement is relates to something I think you'll get a kick out of. I had on the show, so this is the Into the Impossible podcast, Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. Curiosity is our key byproduct here. And I had on Carl Sagan's widow, as I mentioned. Her name is Andrewian. And I asked her this question. I'm going to ask it to you. I said, in the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, there's a scene in the opening moments, which is based on Arthur C. Clarke's book, where these apes come upon this monolith in the savannah of Africa, and they start hitting it, and they start bashing it, and there's nothing they can do with it. They try to do all sorts of things. They can't extract anything from this object. Then later it appears like on the surface of the moon, and it seems to be like a time capsule, a billion-year-long time capsule put by an ancient, technologically advanced civilization. And I asked Andrew, and I'm going to ask you too, what would you put on a billion-year-long lasting time capsule? But she said to me, I already did that. I said, what are you talking about? And she said, on the Voyager 1 spacecraft, Carl Sagan, encrypted this record that with her brainwaves. And when she had just fallen in love with Carl, it was quite poignant. And also sounds of Earth and birds and apes and whatever, and music from around the world. It was actually the first example of what's called ethnomusicography or world music. Anyway, I want to ask you, Avi, what would you put on an Oumuamua of your own to travel and ply our galaxy for the next billion years? What piece of wisdom or time capsule content would you put on it, in it, around it?
Well, I would make Noah's spaceship. I would put a very advanced computer with AI and a 3D printer, and hopefully by the time we launch it, we would understand how to create synthetic life in the laboratory. There are several people trying to do that, including a colleague of mine, Jack Szostak here, a Nobel laureate at Harvard. So I would do that, and then whoever finds it can use that machine to create life as we have on Earth, and that's much more informative than a golden record. Who cares who the Beatles were? Like I don't think. Okay, let's put it this way: I don't think that we are so accomplished that we are worthy. I mean, it will be actually humiliating if they look at us and say and laugh. They would say, "What are these primitive creatures doing?" But if you can have the information of how to recreate what we have here and launch it into space, that would be great.
Yeah.
Now, I should say that, you might ask, is there any possibility that we will find, if there was a civilization before us, technological, let's say 1 billion years ago, would we find any evidence? The answer is no, because there is geological activity on Earth, and anything that was here more than 100 million years ago was turned around and mixed in. So if there were computer terminals on Earth, they were churned up and they are now deep in the interior of the Earth. We can't really tell. So if you want to leave something like a stature that would indicate that we were there, you want to put it on a surface that doesn't have geological activity. And, the moon is an example.
Yeah.
I mean, the moon, the only thing that happens on the moon is that there are impacts.
Yeah.
That, they go 10 meters deep, but not much more than that. But other than that, I mean, the moon is a museum. It collects all the things that fall on it. And by the way, there is a plan to go back to the moon. As far as I'm concerned, the most exciting thing we can do is just go around and see if there is any evidence for some technological debris that collided with the moon.
Yeah. A year ago, exactly, we had an event here with Paul Davies, who I know you know, and Jim Benford, and it was called Is E.T. Lurking in Our Own Celestial Neighborhood? And they talked not only about the surface of the moon as this ideal, kind of desiccated environment in which anything could survive for very long periods of time, but also these Trojan asteroids, these asteroids that are tiny little balls of, kind of rubble piles, but some are solid, and you could put something there if you wanted to observe and lurk, perhaps. But yes, it's very, so it's very good that I'm just afraid we're going to put it on this little disc, little USB drive, and they're going to get it and be like, all right, and they'll say, thanks, but we already discovered string theory. Thanks very much.
By the way, I should tell you that the reaction of my colleagues to Oumuamua being a rock, that to me reminds me of what a caveman would have said if you were to present the caveman with a cell phone, because he would, seeing rocks all of his life, he would say, well, it's a shiny rock. And it's the same reaction that astronomers have.
It reminds me of there's an old joke of these people are doing excavations in the Middle East somewhere, and they go to some country, or maybe it's Asia. They dig under, they find like copper wire. It looks like copper wire, and they say, oh, this is evidence that we had underground cables carrying power and Ethernet or whatever. And then some Israeli guy says, big deal, look over here. And the archaeologists say, there's nothing there. And they say, yeah, obviously they had Wi-Fi communication. They didn't need a wire. Okay.
But just one thing I wanted to mention. Yeah. Oumuamua, there was a seminar at Harvard that I attended along with a sort of mainstream conservative astronomer that worked on rocks in the solar system all his life. And as we were walking out of the seminar, the guy was saying to me, and I will not mention the name, he was saying, I wish it never existed. It's so weird. I wish it never existed. Now, to me, I cannot hear that thing, because how can a scientist say about observed facts, I wish they never existed? I mean, obviously they come in conflict with what he had thought about all the objects in space, but you never say that. You say, great, there is an anomaly. Let's figure out what it is. Cosmologists would have been thrilled to find something that never existed, indicates what the nature of the dark matter is.
Yeah.
That would be fantastic if we see evidence for an anomaly that indicates that. So scientists should be grateful for any evidence coming their way, even if it is surprising. And unfortunately, a lot of colleagues are just looking for evidence that confirms what they already knew.
That's right. And they lose that child. I always say, I agree with you, Avi. Scientists are like children. I've got blessed to have children. And, they're curious. They smile. They play. They're also very selfish. They don't like to share their toys. They don't like to share credit. So it's like scientists, we have to balance the good aspects. I asked, obviously, I ask all my guests these questions. I asked Barry Barish the same question, and he said curiosity is what I'd like to transmit to future generations, because we get such a negative notion of curiosity. What's this famous saying? Curiosity killed the cat. Curiosity is dangerous. It's mendacious. It's perhaps volatile. You have to be aware. No, scientists, and it reminded me. And I told him, and this is a podcast that I recommend you go on by the name James Altucher. Far more. You should.
I was invited.
You should do it. It's far better than this podcast.
No, it's already planned.
Okay, great. So James and I did a TED Talk together, and he did one and I did one the same day. And in his TED Talk, he brought up some data, and he said that children smile or laugh 300 and plus times per day. And guess how many times per day an adult laughs? It's something like 6. And I felt like that's kind of what happens with people in terms of curiosity. I have a kid. He's young, and he just keeps asking, like, can you push on a black hole? What happens if you push a black hole into the center of a galaxy? Could you do galactic engineering? I'm just like, even I can't answer these questions. So I refer him to my colleagues in string theory.
That's the making of a real physicist. So it's wonderful to hear that.
Yeah.
Your child has the potential. Send him to Harvard after.
I will, but he's got his heart set on UCSD, the Harvard of the West Coast.
Okay, well, I have to speak with him.
Okay, you will. Yeah, when we get together next, maybe, and we'll get together in Beijing next time. Last question I ask all my. Oh, by the way, your colleague. Guess what your colleague across the Harvard yard said he would put on it. Kamran Vafa. What he would put on his monolith to last for 1 billion years would be the equations of string theory. So I found that very, very interesting and kind of curious. But I love Kamran.
If you want to demonstrate our herd mentality, that would be a fine.
Okay. Last question. Now we're going to go backwards in time. We went forwards in time 1 billion years. We went forwards in time with your ethical Zava'a. Now I want to ask you the last question. Sir Arthur C. Clarke had these famous 3 laws. The first one is, and I think you mentioned this, any advanced technology, sufficiently advanced technology, is indistinguishable from magic. That's number 1. Obviously, if Oumuamua is true, they actually did create, some beings created basically this magical device. Number 2 is for every expert, there's an equal and opposite expert. I feel like, we have this notion of listen to scientists, and like scientists, we don't agree. If you ever find a scientist, right, Avi? If you find a scientist and that person says, you have to listen to me, you must obey me, I think you and I have a rebellious spirit, but even the common scientist would say, go to hell. I don't have to obey you or listen.
It should be the way to decide things in science is based on evidence and data. If there are conflicting interpretations, you just want to collect more data.
Yeah.
That's the way to make progress.
So the last question is, his third law says the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. And that's right. The origin of the name of this podcast, the Into the Impossible podcast. It's part of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. Avi, last question. If you could tell a 20-year-old Avi, 30-year-old Avi, just getting started in your career, something seems impossible to you now, young Avi, but have courage, get through it, and in retrospect, it'll be the best thing that ever happened to you. What advice would you give to a younger version of yourself?
Yeah. So the biggest mistake I made was that, I always have a stream of ideas that come up, naturally, bubble up, whenever I hear about the results and what is being done, practiced in a field. And initially, I was bringing up those ideas to the attention of the experts and listening to what they say. And if they said it's not worth pursuing, I wouldn't pursue them. But then I realized that some of these ideas are picked up by other people once they hear me saying them and they followed those ideas, and they led to the most interesting insights in those areas. And after it happened to me multiple times, 15 years ago, I said, the hell with it. I just wouldn't listen to what people say. The experts very often dismiss things that go beyond what they thought. And if you bring up a new notion, a new idea, they would dismiss it irrespective of whether it merits attention or not, just because it's different. It's just like kids in a kindergarten. Whenever they see something different, they bully that kid because he or she are different. That's a sufficient reason to bully someone. And it's true also of Twitter, right? So anyway, so I learned this lesson after a while, and I lost some important opportunities to innovate. Other people got credit for things that I told them. But then at some point I said, the hell with it. I would not pay attention to what other people say and just pursue what seems right to me. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but that's the whole purpose of tenure, to allow you to go in directions that you find appropriate, and somehow a university, the system, the academic system, puts some confidence in you and says, we allow you to explore things that, in directions that you might be wrong, but take some risk. And the strange thing is, if you look at the private sector, commercial sector, companies like Google, starting with Bell Labs, they took risks. They had physicists think about blue sky research, come up with ideas that were not conventional at the time, and had a lot of Nobel Prizes actually given to people in Bell Labs. And now the academic community, I find, is more conservative than the business world. How is that possible? The whole purpose of tenure is to allow people to be innovative and go in directions that others do not necessarily accept. Whereas in the private sector, it's all about making a profit. You find a person like Elon Musk advocating for some technologies that were not popular at all at the time, and he's now the wealthiest person on earth. And he did it because he realized that if you take risks, there is a chance of you making a huge profit. Okay? So how come the academic community is not recognizing that? Yeah. It must mean that we are losing a lot of opportunities to innovate, to find new things. Gravitational wave astrophysics was almost demolished because the astronomy community did not support it. Fortunately, there were some administrators in NSF that decided to support it. But I remember as a postdoc, I heard a lot of bad stuff about gravitational wave. And the same about search for exoplanets. There are lots of examples. And I'm just worried that there were many good ideas in science that were lost because of this. And I'm trying to help to bring us to a better place in terms of the health of our mission as scientists, being honest, straightforward, making mistakes. Don't worry about your image, worry more about nature. Yeah. That's my message.
That's a magnificent message. Yeah, Max Tegmark was on last week, and he said, imagine if Twitter existed back in 1610 when Galileo announced the discovery of satellites around the planet Jupiter. They would have said, fact check, experts in the Catholic Church have disputed this claim.
I should tell you that I have no footprint on social media.
I know.
Twitter, and that
explains your productivity. Your H index is inversely proportional to the time you spend on Twitter.
Right. I mean, if you look at, again, on the beach, you see the sand that you find on the beach are seashells that were grounded up by rubbing against each other. And they all, all these grains of sand look the same. They look similar. You don't want scientists to rub against each other and break up into pieces that are indistinguishable. That's very bad for innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Avi, I can't thank you enough for going into the impossible with me. I want to wish you all the best of success wherever the book may take you. And since you don't follow, are not a big presence on social media, I will do my best to promote you inside and outside of all these video venues. And otherwise, I will let you know when this comes out. Anyway, for now, I wish you Shabbat Shalom, because you must not work 7 days a week. That's the only thing I would implore you not to do. You're so productive. You get so much done. But we all need a day of rest. I command my graduates. The only thing I bring religion into the public sphere. I say, I command you, you may not work at least 1 day a week. I don't care what day a week it is. You need to rest. You need to recuperate. But I know you're going into a very busy period for you. I wish you stamina. I wish you resiliency, but I know you already have it. So I wish you all the best, Avi. Thank you for coming with us on the show, Going Into the Impossible.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.